Hi, my name is Maclaine Diemer, and I'm the lead composer for Guild Wars 2 End of Dragons. We just finished 3 amazing days here at Ocean Way Studios in Nashville, recording with some of the world's best musicians. We're going to combine the orchestra that you're used to hearing in the game with some amazing new sounds that come from Korea to bring you into the world of Cantha.
Hello, my name's Cady. I'm the audio director at ArenaNet. I'm really looking forward to really bringing that listener into the mix. It's going to be a full immersive experience. I want you to feel the room. I want you to feel the cellos on the right side and the horns to the left and the trumpets and trombones in back of those cellos and violas. So I can't wait to finish this process up and get it to you guys, and so you can listen to it.
It's been a lot of work, and you have all made it into something special. So thank you very much.
Hi Tyria, happy Friday and welcome to Guild Chat. I'm your host Ruby and I'm so glad you're all here with us today for this show. We are 10 days away from End of Dragons. Just a week and a half left until launch. You still have 10 days if you haven't yet to pre-purchase to get those account bonuses on your account and to be entered in the Dragon Legacy sweepstakes. Prizes for that, there are so many prizes for that, including there's a DX Racer gaming chair with End of Dragons, gaming gear from HyperX, a gaming laptop, a trip for 2 to come visit us at ArenaNet, and a whole lot more. You can go over to guildwars2.com after the show to read all about the Dragon Legacy sweepstakes, what all the prizes are, and how to make sure that you are entered to win some of those prizes. I also want to show you one more thing real quick for a preview of something that's going to help you celebrate launch week with us. Starting on March 2nd on launch week up until March 29th, Hardee's and Carl's Jr.'s locations are going to be serving their large drinks in these cool End of Dragons collector's cups while supplies last. So go get one for yourself and get something to drink while you're celebrating the launch of End of Dragons. So for today's show, we're going to go behind the scenes of music and sound design. We've been watching all of your reactions to the music and seeing how much you love it. So we are going to talk all about it today with our two dev guests. So let me say hi to them, and I'll have them tell a little bit about themselves, starting with Maclaine. Hi, Maclaine. Thank you so much for joining us. Oh, you're muted. That's ironic.
It wouldn't be video conference without one of us being muted.
Well, I'm glad we got it out of the way right from the start, and now we're good. So
Yeah.
thank you for taking that hit for us.
I swear I'm a professional. My name is Maclaine Diemer. I am the lead composer for Guild Wars 2 End of Dragons and the music director on this project, I suppose. I've been writing music for Guild Wars for a decade now and working on the game for 12 years. So, yeah, anyway, it's good to be back.
Yeah, I'm so glad you are. And our audio director, Cady, is with us today, too. Hi, Drew.
Hello, yes. My name is Cady. I'm the audio director at ArenaNet. I'm so happy this is audio week and we can dig in to End of Dragons sound effects and music. I've been wanting to talk about this. I mean, with Maclaine, I'm sure we've been like, I want to share this with the world. So happy to be here with you all and to share in the details.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have a lot of details today. This is a longer show than usual today. I don't think out of the three of us, any one of us are unhappy about it. So let's get started. End of Dragons there's a lot different than what you've done before. So why don't we start talking about the overall musical aesthetic and the new opportunities that brought?
Sure. So, we're all familiar with what Guild Wars sounds like. The core of it has always been beautiful, lush, orchestral music. And that's not any different on this score. But when Drew kind of initially reached out to me to start talking about this expansion, we wanted to talk about what was going to be different, what was going to separate it from the last couple and the last decade of Guild Wars music. And the big thing, obviously, is the inspiration that we took from East Asia to represent Kantha, specifically Korea. The original version of Kantha in Guild Wars Factions was kind of a pastiche of a lot of East Asian influences, and the studio wanted to kind of hone that into one specifically, and this time decided on Korea, which, from a musical standpoint, provided an amazing opportunity because this was only something I learned after the fact, but traditional Korean music, which is called gugak or kugak, it's kind of a sort of in between a G or a K sound, is not very well known outside of Korea. I tried to find examples of it in games, in movies, and TV shows, and they exist, but they're very, very sparse, especially compared to more traditional kind of Japanese or Chinese music. That is well represented, especially in the West. We've kind of been experiencing that kind of influence on our pop culture for 50 or 60 years now, but Korea has yet to kind of make that leap. And so I think we have a really unique opportunity with End of Dragons to present this stuff to a broader audience outside of Korea. And I'm very excited about it. So you saw a little bit of that in the video that we just showed with that piece of music, which I'm here to confirm, everybody. That is the main theme to End of Dragons. That is going to be the first thing you hear when you launch the game, and I'm sure there are many people who are very excited about that. I've read all your comments about the Path of Fire theme for the last 5 years, and I hear you. So anyway, we'll get excited about that. There's little snippets in that video of some of the interesting Korean soloists that we incorporated into this soundtrack, but we have a slightly longer kind of montage of just some Korean soloists to give you a sense of the scope of some interesting and unique instruments that you'll hear on the soundtrack. So let's take a listen.
Maclaine, you can learn how to say for next time. 수고하셨습니다. 수고. Like 수고. Okay, 수고하셨습니다. Yeah, 하셨습니다.
Oh,
Yeah.
good.
That means good work or you worked hard and you had a hard time, and so good job.
Oh, great. Okay. That's it. Sugo.
수고하셨습니다.
수고하셨습니다.
Good.
수고하셨습니다.
Poor
I love
Blaine.
that clip. Yeah. I'm not exaggerating. It's about 4 a.m. For me in that clip, and I'm just trying to stay awake. And they're trying to teach me Korean, so I'm very patient. I hope I got close to the right pronunciation. And I should say that I'm going to pronounce some words here that I've done my best to learn how to pronounce, but please forgive me if I butcher any of them. So that's, there's a couple extra ones that I couldn't show in the video because we didn't have video of them, but that range of instruments is really the heart of this soundtrack, and those musicians were just unbelievable. It was such a joy to hear them playing and bringing that really distinct Korean sound to this score.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, go ahead.
I think we're going to say the same thing. Let's look at more of them because, like you said, there's more than we can show.
Yeah, so there's kind of 3 broad groups that they can kind of be broken down into. There are winds, which are powered by the human breath. There are the strings, and then there's percussion, right? So let's take a look at some of the wind instruments first. Okay, so I'm gonna do this clockwise, and I'm gonna do my best to pronounce them. So in the upper left-hand corner, we have the taegum, which is a large bamboo flute. Then to the right of that, we have the taepyeongso. Below that is a combo picture. Very difficult to find pictures of some of these instruments, by the way. So below that is the danso and the sanghuang, which I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that properly, but that's my best attempt. And then the final one in the bottom left is the piri. And so all of these appear in some form or another on the score. I'll just talk about a couple of them really quickly. So the first one that is kind of, the star of the show, I would say, is the taegum, right? This is a very distinctly unique flute to Korean music. It might look similar to some other, Chinese and Japanese bamboo flutes that you've seen, but the kind of distinguishing characteristic, if you can sort of see on this slide, between his hand and mouth, there's a little gold kind of plate that's wrapped around the flute. And that's covering up a small hole that is covered by a membrane, which I don't know if it's paper or synthetic or like a cured kind of animal skin or something like that. Mm-hmm. But there's a little membrane that covers this hole. It operates on the same principle that a kazoo operates on, with the wax paper covering that hole. So when the player plays and they sort of breathe into it a little harder, or maybe hit a certain note that resonates a certain way, that membrane will buzz very rapidly, and it creates this very distinct, almost like a natural distortion sound or a buzzing sound. And once you kind of hear it, it's you like I said, it's unmistakable, and it's very specific to the sound of Korean music with this particular flute. And it was important to kind of capture that and allow it to be as expressive as it naturally is across this whole score. The person that we got playing that flute is just unbelievable, and he would take my crappy demos and my notes on the page, and he would just elevate them. And there were so many times where we would do a take, and he would play what was written, and then I would say, okay, good, we got that as a safety. Why don't we do a take where you just put the natural expression into it that you normally would if you were playing this kind of music. And those obviously are the takes that we used in the game because they're way better than what I wrote. But it's just such a cool and interesting and beautiful instrument. And because it's a little bit bigger than some bamboo flutes you're used to hearing, it has almost like a tenor quality to it. It's hard to describe, but I love the sound of it. Okay, let's look at the strings. Strings. Look at all these beautiful pictures. I love the outfits that they're wearing in the background.
So gorgeous.
I stole these off of YouTube, but anyway, you should Google these instruments, and these videos will come up. You can hear them in all their glory. Okay, so these are kind of the 4 core stringed instruments, I think, for Kugak music. So we've got the kaegum in the upper left, which is like a plucked zither. Looks very similar to a koto or a guzheng, which are the Japanese and Chinese equivalents of this instrument. There's some differences, which I'll come back to. To the right of that is the komungo, which is also a zither, except that is played with a stick instead of your fingers. So it's hard to see in this slide, but she's holding a stick that's about the size of a pencil and uses it to strike the strings and kind of pluck them. And it has this amazing kind of throaty snap, kind of attack to it that I love. The clip of the woman playing it in the montage we just showed, she was like a wizard on that thing. It was so cool to watch her operate. Below that is the ajang, which is also a type of zither, except this one is played with a bow. And then to the bottom left is the hegum. And the hegum, you might recognize it or be familiar with its cousin, the erhu, which is the Chinese version of it. But this one has evolved into its own kind of unique instrument. That's different tonality, different styles of playing it, but a very beautiful and expressive instrument. So I want to talk about the kayagum a little bit. So the kayagum is kind of the other side of the coin to the End of Dragon score and to Korean music in general. It's really one of the key sort of distinct Korean instruments. It's, like I said, it's a plucked zither, right? Shares some kind of characteristics with a harp, I guess. I made the mistake early on of writing parts that you would write for a harp that you would play on this thing that it doesn't really work that way. So I had to kind of adjust my writing technique halfway through the score. But it's that instrument and the daegum are on more than half of the tracks in the soundtrack. They're just so beautiful and so versatile. What I find amazing about all of those plucked sort of stringed instruments, and in particular the kayagum, is the strings are slightly different than their Chinese or Japanese equivalents. The koto and the guzheng have kind of modernized a little bit in the industrial age and have strings that are made out of steel generally, kind of like a guitar, basically. They are louder, they resonate a little bit more, they sustain a little bit more. But for the kayagum, the strings have kind of maintained this traditional tightly wound silk. And it means that they don't sustain quite as much as their steel string equivalent. But what they can do is they're unbelievably flexible. And you saw that, I think, in some of the video of the kayagum, of the ajang as well, and even the hegum. The strings are all kind of the same on all of them. And they're so flexible. And it allows the player to bend them very aggressively and get this extreme vibrato that we're not even used to hearing here in the West or maybe even in other East Asian kind of traditional music. Heavy duty vibrato, and it's because of the nature of those strings. To me, it's just an interesting and beautiful sound that I wanted to make sure we captured. Yeah, and I'll come back to that vibrato thing in a bit. But let's look at the final slide of the percussion. Okay, this is only some of the percussion. There's some other stuff, but this is kind of the core Korean percussion. Those first four instruments, we have the changu, the buk, I'm going to mess this one up and I apologize, the gwangwari, and the jing. Those four are usually kind of heard together in an ensemble called pungmul ensemble, which is sort of traditionally played by farmers in the rural areas of Korea. It was important to kind of capture the sound of them together because they sort of all do. The changu is sort of the star of the show, and oftentimes will be seen on its own or with an instrumental soloist or a singer. But when there's a percussion ensemble, it's generally those four instruments. And they create this amazing, exciting music that worked really well, not just for ambient tracks in the game, but also for the combat music. Combat music ends up being so percussion heavy. Just the nature of it is to kind of keep the energy up and keep the tension and excitement happening. So it just seemed like such a natural fit because what those four instruments do together is just inherently exciting. It doesn't take much on top of that to kind of make it feel like Guild Wars combat music. And then let's look at the other two. These are really cool. Okay, so if those first four are sort of more for the folk, these last two are traditional kind of royal court instruments, and you typically only use for big holidays and ceremonies. The first one is the pyongyang, and what that person is striking are these tuned stone plates. They're sort of shaped like a boomerang, but each one of them is very carefully refined and tuned to a pitch. And there's, I don't know how many, there's like a, whatever, 20 maybe. And then you strike it with a hammer, and it has this very sharp attack, and not much sustain, surprisingly, but a very clear tone. And then to the right of that is the Pyeongjong, and that is a similar looking instrument in terms of the beautiful ornate wooden frame, but instead of these tuned plate, it has bronze bells. It's also struck with a hammer, and they're typically played together. There's videos out there of kind of court ceremonies, recreations of court ceremonies with massive group of instrumentalists playing all of these instruments, and then there's usually only one of those kind of giant percussion instruments, and they're generally used as like a marker of like a downbeat of a measure, as we would think of it in the West. So it'd be like bang, they would sort of hit this one clear note, and then everybody else would start playing. They're huge, they're heavy, they're very special, and so we had to go to them. I didn't, unfortunately, physically go there. We only did it over Zoom, but our kind of street team in Korea went to a high school that specializes in teaching kids about traditional Korean music, and they happen to have one of each of those, so we got access to it for a few hours one afternoon, which was just amazing. I hope someday to get there in person and see it in person. I would love to. But we incorporated it not just into the music, but also into some of the sound design that maybe Drew could talk a little bit about.
Yeah, it was nice to have the solo instrumentalists, do a little bit after their sessions and give us a little more, plucking or blowing through the flutes and give us more texture for sound design. It's so interesting when we're talking about two different music and sound effects, and we want to blend those together and to make a really immersive soundscape. And so this gave us the opportunity to get the textures back into the sound design. So we did another Foley session, at the high school, and got even more instruments that we didn't have with the solo instruments that we were recording for the soundtrack. And that was so great. I can't thank them enough for taking the time to give us more opportunities to have that sound design textures. It's like a toolbox. We're making a toolbox, and at ArenaNet, when we do each expansion, we're looking for those opportunities to make a specific theme and really dive in deep. And I think we really did it this time.
Oh wow, you did so much with this whole new suite of instruments, and having all of these available creates the opportunity for a whole new distinctive sound to build for End of Dragons. So can you go into the background of that a little bit?
Sure. So, Kantha is not Korea, right? We're not making a game about Korea, but we want to honor that culture. So it took a lot of studying to kind of find the balance, I would say, of what makes this type of music played on these instruments Korean, and then how do we adapt it for Guild Wars? There's, in addition to just the instruments, which is kind of having access to them is sort of the first part of the battle, because you just have them play something and it will automatically sound Korean. But we also wanted to honor the traditional Korean approach to melody and harmony and rhythm, and these are all very distinctive to me, to other East Asian cultures. It took a while to kind of wrap my brain around it, a lot of Googling and a lot of Google Translate, copy and pasting characters that I can't read into YouTube. But yeah, there's those three things. There's three aspects of music, across the world, across every culture. It's melody, harmony, rhythm, right? Those are kind of how everything can be broken down into. So for things like melody, let me come back to that actually. So for things like harmony, because it's more interesting, and I'll ramble a little bit about it. But for harmony, in the West, we're used to, like an orchestra, for instance, playing, the violins might have a beautiful melody, and then the woodwinds or the brass or something might have the accompaniment playing the chords in the background, and then you might have another section playing a counter melody or a harmonized line with the melody. We're very familiar with that sound. Korean music, it doesn't really approach it like that. They even though there's all these beautiful instruments, they tend to play melodic figures all in unison. And so, incorporating that into something like the main theme that we heard at the top, you'll notice that when those instruments are playing the melody, there's not a ton of harmonic support, and there's almost no, I don't think the main melody is harmonized. It's literally just like, everybody get on this, play the melody in whatever range works for you. And it's great because, for something like a main theme, you want it to be catchy, you want it to stick in your head. And if everybody's playing it, then you're going to notice it, right? The kind of more traditional Western orchestral approach doesn't really kick in until the B section of it, when there's kind of a secondary melody and there's the violins sort of take it up and there's counter lines and the horns and things like that. But then in the back half, it truly is like, bam, everybody just play the melody. Except for the brass, which they sound awesome playing these low chords. That's what they like to do. So then, in terms of rhythm, this also you hear a little bit in the main melody. In the West, our sort of default rhythmic structure is based around even numbers, right? 2 and 4, right? So you've got, like, if you're going to count it off, you would have 1, 2, 3, 4, right? And it would be just, increments of 2 or 4 or 8 or whatever. And it's not completely uncommon to hear things that are in what they call sort of a triplet feel, or a triple meter, or 3/4 time is kind of an old-timey way to refer to it, where things will be subdivided in groups of 3. A lot of traditional Celtic music, our sort of evolution of folk music has this sort of triplet feel. But in Korean music, so much of the rhythmic structure is based around triplets. So things that are divided into 3 or 6 or 9 or 12. There's interesting other much more complex rhythms that I still have a hard time grasping. But the sort of foundation is this lilting triplet feel that has this kind of like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And so the main theme, when it finally kind of kicks in, has this sort of 12/8 feel, if for the music nerds out there. That was very intentional to try to give it that, distinctly Korean feel. And then in terms of melody, this is where it gets exciting, right?
Yeah.
There are multiple kind of different approaches to a scale called the pentatonic scale, which is, foundational to a lot of folk music around the world, for reasons that are too sort of lengthy to get into here. But a pentatonic scale, if you're a music nerd, you know what that is, and you might be very familiar with the way it sounds. But the way that different, kind of traditional cultures in Korea approach that, it varied by region, right? The country could sort of be divided up along sort of the topography of it, right? The mountains and riverways separating different regions, and each one of those distinct regions developed a unique approach to scales. But there's one in particular, which we have a slide of, which we can show, that is very, very distinctly Korean. And I really apologize, I'm going to butcher this one. Okay, so this is pronounced Yukchabaji Tori. And even though it's all written as one word, that suffix Tori, T-O-R-I, just means scale or mode. And Yukchabaji is kind of the name for this particular type of mode. And if you look at it, it's very simple, right? It's essentially just 3 notes, or kind of like 3.5 notes. And this sound, once somebody pointed this out to me, I heard it all over Korean music, everything I was listening to. I had this like light bulb moment of like, aha, there it is. And it kind of was my access point to incorporating this music into Guild Wars and how we would kind of adapt it. So I have a piano sound up here, which I hope you can hear. I'm turn my mic around a little bit and turn this up. So I'm going to play it. So if we can get that on screen again. Yeah. So in the Western approach to music, this would be in the key of A. And A is the middle note where it says plain tone, right? So that's this note. And the way they approach this from a sort of melodic figure standpoint is they would play that A, and they would jump up to the C, which is the black note there, where in parentheses, and then quickly jump down to the B below that. That's why there's the little loopy arrow pointing to it, right? And then from there would drop down to the E below, which is the note that says heavy vibrato. And so let me play it without talking through it. This type of melodic figure, it can be embellished, in many different ways, but you'll hear this in a lot of Korean music. You'll even hear a little bit of it in the main theme. And then, as it says on that slide, when it gets to the E below the A, heavy vibrato. And so heavy vibrato was the first thing that I noticed about Korean music, it was the first thing that jumped out to my ears. Across every one of those instruments we showed in those slides, even across the different types of vocal styles that they have in Korean music, it is a defining characteristic, I think, of Korean gugak music. And it was interesting. It was a learning experience for me because in the West, we're used to heavy vibrato being used for comedic effect, and maybe we can illustrate that now.
Oh, wait, and there's another one. There's the slide
I
whistle.
appreciate this so much.
Cartoon, yeah.
Yeah, and just because I've spent 40 years growing up in the West watching cartoons and hearing that trope of vibrato being used as something silly for somebody slipping on a banana peel or whatever. When I first heard it listening to Korean music, I was like, whoa, this is, I have to kind of reframe this and retrain my brain to hear this in a different way, because I don't want it. It's not silly, right? They're not using it for comedic effect,
right?
And I really had to retrain my musical barometer, I guess, recalibrate it to understand why they were doing it, understand when they were doing it, and to appreciate it so that we could incorporate it, respectfully into the music. So that's kind of the foundation, I would say, of at least what we tried to adapt for the End of Dragon score from Korean music.
Yeah. We also had an internal team member, Sung Ha Hong, who is Korean, which she dug in early in the process and made a PDF of a lot of instrumentation, melodies, rhythms, had traditional examples as well as new pop culture examples, and gave that to Maclaine, and he continued to kind of give that to other composers as we work with them. So yeah, it was such a help and support in this process, and I want to thank her for that.
Absolutely. Sungha is awesome. I'm so glad that she's part of the team. All right, so here's my question. You had you had to retrain your ear. You had to learn all of these new things, whole new suite of instruments, whole new type of sound. This obviously went completely perfectly right from the beginning with no issues, correct? Don't make a liar of me.
you have a great deal of faith in me. You think very highly of me, and I maybe thought a little bit too highly of myself going into this process. I thought, a third expansion. Well, I've already done it twice. I've been writing Guild Wars music for so long, and I've been making music for so long. Surely I can, teach myself about Korean music quickly and, incorporate it, and everything will work out great.
There's like klaxons in my head.
Yeah, and there should be, and there should have been in mine as well. There's certainly enough space for them up there.
Oh no.
So what ended up happening was, I did very, very cursory research on Korean music. This was almost 2 years ago, this time of year. I did some very light research and ended up putting together 3 kind of concept pieces of music to pitch to the studio, to get some feedback on, say, is this the right direction? How do we feel about this? Knowing that we would have to balance the elements of orchestra, Korean stuff, and synthesizer sounds, which we'll get to eventually. Yeah. So I wrote a few things, and some of them were okay. Some of them I stole from later on once I got on a roll and incorporated them into a couple tracks. But I wrote a track that was ostensibly the main theme, right? It had the vibe of a main theme, and it didn't end up being the main theme, but there are some similarities. I thought I did a good job. I played it for the studio. We had a meeting about it, and they very politely told me that it was time to go back to the drawing board. So we have a clip of it. Let's take a listen. I'll talk a little bit more afterwards. It's painful for
I
me to hear that.
oh, I can hear what you're talking about. It's not. It shouldn't be painful. It was a learning process.
Sure, but you started airing your dirty laundry. But
Oh,
yeah, it was a learning process, and it was important. When I go back and listen to that now, there's nothing Korean about it. And I'm not even an expert. I feel like I've said this to pretty much anyone who will listen, that even though the game is coming out and the soundtrack is done, to me it's just the start of my journey with this music, because I truly fell in love with it, and I feel like I've only just started to scratch the surface of my understanding of it. But when I wrote that, it was like I knew less than zero. And the studio, the folks we had in the meeting, they basically said, you kind of did what we were hoping you wouldn't do, and what I was hoping I wouldn't do, which was just sort of sprinkle this like fairy dust of generic Hollywood, exotic East Asian sound over this, and it sort of is the intro, and it does that thing, and then it kind of shuffles it off to the side, and then ends up just being a Guild Wars thing without anything, Korea or even Asian inspired at all in it. And it was important to kind of have someone point out to me like, hey, this isn't what you think it is, and maybe you can try again. And there's no shame in failure. It was a humbling moment, and it was a moment that stuck with me throughout the entirety of the writing process. And I think it was really important to go through that.
yeah, and it sounds like it was super worth it in the end, because what we came up with and what was created out of that has turned out so incredibly well, and it's absolutely gorgeous. So let's take that and move forward with how you took that foundation and that learning experience and how you made it work for End of Dragons, how you turned it into this expansion's music.
Yeah, so up until now, we've kind of just talked about two of the three pillars of the score, right? There's the Guild Wars orchestra sound that you're used to hearing. There's the Korean gugak sound that you will hear hopefully for the first time, or recognize if you're familiar with it. And then there's this third element, which is really the wild card, and made things even trickier to find a balance for, which was, we're going back to Cantha, but we haven't seen Cantha in 250 years. In that time, they have found this amazing source of energy in the Jade Sea that powers this, very high-tech Jade tech. Makes this kind of has reshaped the city into something much more futuristic looking. And so the studio, to kind of musically represent that, they said they really wanted to hear a lot more synthesizers and electronic textures being sort of pushed to the forefront, which is not something we've traditionally done with Guild Wars. There's been a little bit of it with the Asura, because they are also kind of an advanced technological society. But still a very light touch, and that's sort of the nature of the fantasy genre. Is you want to sort of there's an established sort of sound palette, both for fantasy and for Guild Wars, that we stick with. But this is like we're going to see things we've never seen before, and it'll look very futuristic. So it has to sound a little bit futuristic as well. And of course, there's no shortage of just pure synthesizer sounds on the score. But when you just use synth sounds, I think you run the risk of it sounding like a sci-fi game, and even though it's sci-fi adjacent, it's still a fantasy game. Sure. So we had to kind of ground it in reality, and our approach to that was to take acoustic instruments and heavily process them with electronic plugins and all sorts of interesting mangling to turn them into something unfamiliar. So traditionally with an acoustic instrument, like for instance a cello, you might record it, you put a good microphone in front of this beautiful instrument, you have somebody playing it who, has spent their life trying to master it, and you just want to kind of get out of the way. You want the recording to sound like you're in the room with them and capture the natural acoustic sound of that instrument. Well, we didn't do that. The sort of baseline orchestras, I guess, treat it naturally, but not always. There are times where we did some stuff that you're not usually supposed to do with an orchestra. And then especially with some of the soloists, we would do things wrong. We would put delay, and we would put flangers and phasers and distortion and pitch shifting and all sorts of anything to make it sound interesting and otherworldly, as if it was emerging from Cantha, right? Like, what would their version of this music sound like if they applied that technology to their musical instruments? So we have a clip of one of the tracks that'll play in New Kaineng City that I think demonstrates this pretty well.
Let's hear it. I love this track so
I
much.
got chills. I got chills. It's lovely. So fun. I mean,
It's
it
so
kind of
good.
ties the music and just it's like sound designing the music, and it's so interesting. So nice work, McLean,
Yeah.
on
Oh,
on really having fun and being playful and
Mhm.
trying to fit the aesthetic of these maps with the music.
yeah. Well, I thank you for the opportunity to try some new stuff. There's been a couple instances over the years where I've been like writing something and thinking, is this too much? Is the studio going to accept this? Are the players going to accept this? And every time I've kind of rolled the dice, and the feedback has been great. So I hope
Yeah.
it's great for this. Whoever's monitoring the chat, maybe it can give me some instant feedback on whether or not they like it.
That would be
But
me, and they love it.
oh, great! All right,
Super,
excellent.
super good reaction. But yeah, this one I love because it's such a good example of exactly what you were talking about, doing things you're not supposed to. Like it's dreary and kind of ugly, but in a good way.
Yeah, yeah. So, the snippet of it that we heard, it's a much longer track, obviously, but the snippet of it that we heard, there's really only three things happening there, even though it sounds very dense, right? There's this droning synth pad at the very bottom. Then there's this kind of synth pulse that sort of keeps the motion going. And then this cello solo, and that's all that's happening there. But there's so many effects and distortion and reverb and stuff just swirling around you. But I wanted to highlight what the cello was doing, outside of it, because it might be hard to kind of, I know what it sounds like because I wrote it, but it might be hard to sort of take those elements out without hearing it on its own. And we had this unbelievable cello player named Rowan, and they are just incredible at playing both beautiful things, but also coaxing interesting sounds out of this gorgeous instrument. That are slightly eerie and unfamiliar. Maybe can sound a little distorted. It can almost sound like guitar feedback sometimes, where it's hitting some of these kind of overtones that you typically would shy away from if you're trying to make it sound beautiful. And then also that heavy vibrato. I had a discussion with them about kind of what makes Korean music Korean, and we honed in on that vibrato thing, and they just went nuts with it at a couple spots. But then after we got this amazing recording, which already sounded incredible, that's when it was time to kind of muck things up a little bit. And so we put on the delay and the distortion. And the idea was if you're in the slums, that's where all the refuse of Kaineng is kind of coming down to. So I was like, what would this sound like if you were if like Drew said, if there was some busker that had a cello and was propped up in a giant sewer pipe, where just trash was streaming out of it? What would their music sound like as it echoes around through that giant pipe? So you hear the playing of this beautiful instrument, then when it stops, this nasty kind of low, rumbly, pitch shifted, distorted delay kind of bubbles up from the bottom, and I wanted it to feel like you were in the underbelly of this city. So anyway, that's one of my favorite tracks.
Yeah, it is for good reason. So we talking about this being in the slums of New Kaineng, and you'll hear that down in there, gives me a good point. I want to talk a little bit more about the different maps in End of Dragons. I know we've been super focused on the music and just how it was built, but let's go through the maps and just talk about how the music and the actual audio work throughout the map work together. So we can start with Xingje.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so we have all these interesting textures and techniques from the Western Orchestra and the Korean gugok instruments and the way that they play. And then we, bring in the synthesizers, and then we have to bring them into the world of Kantha. And that's already a whole lot of options already. And then we have such diverse maps in Kantha, which is just, it's so fun. We had the Xingje, Kaineng City, Ekawald, and Jade Sea. So Xingje, as you were talking about, very traditional, lush, natural, dreamlike. We had Sungha again, since she knows this kind of aesthetic. She did all the sound effects. She implemented while learning the tool. And she actually just owned the whole map at the end, just like you got this, go with it. And so yeah,
Good.
she kind of stitched it all together and made this believable. And then Maclaine comes in and writes tons of just amazing pieces for this. And maybe you can talk a little bit about Xingje.
Yeah. So as Drew mentioned, it's supposed to be kind of natural feeling, right? It still has elements of Jade Tech to it, but it's our introduction to Cantha, and it hasn't been sort of fully subsumed by or taken over by this Jade Tech. So, for me, there's an example of this for every map, but I like to have some kind of high level notion. I call it my egghead ideas because I have a giant egghead. My egghead ideas to sort of trigger some sort of inspiration to start the process of writing for a map and capture the aesthetic. So with Xingje, it's all very natural feeling, even with the Jade Tech elements. And I thought, well, what if I was, sitting on a beautiful rolling hill underneath a cherry blossom tree with my Tegum or my Kaigum, and all of a sudden the breeze kicks up and blows some petals off, and I see them just kind of drifting off into the distance. What kind of music would I make? And the first piece of music I wrote for the map was sort of with that in mind, and it helped me kind of feel what I wanted the map to feel, and preserve some of that natural element to it. It still has orchestra and some electronic and synth textures, but it's very much focused on the sort of natural acoustic aspects of some of these instruments. And then maybe Drew can talk a little bit more about New Kaineng.
Yeah.
Kaineng City, yeah. Lots of levels, as you previously mentioned. High, mid, slums. That's kind of contrasts each other. And so, with that score you're talking about, it's a little nicer up here. It gets pretty heavy and murky down there. So yes, sounds. Chris Burgess worked on this. He's an internal member of the team, sound design team. Loves synthesizers, has a lot of them. He knows that aesthetic, and so having him do the map was really a treat. He spent a lot of time building up these samples and this kind of toolbox of sounds to fill out Kaineng. And these can be very abstract, or they can be something I could hear these footsteps and people talking in the walla, and I believe that, but what's this other thing, and what's that effect on it, and it just kind of blurs the line, and it makes things really interesting. We also took snippets of the solo instruments, so this was really interesting. We taking solo instruments and adding an effect to them so they are rooted into the world, and they're buskers. So we have buskers in the map, and it's very subtle, but it draws you in more. It's the soundscape. So that's the whole thing we want to do. Is music is up here, sound design is here. We want to blur those lines, and that's part of that way we're blurring the lines. And yeah, I think that map really turned out well. It's such a contrast from the other maps we've done in Tyria, and yeah, so fun.
Oh, wow. So how about Echo Vault? Let's look at that one now.
Sure.
Yeah, Echo Vault.
Maclaine. Oh, okay.
Petrified Forest.
No, I was like, nobody's going.
Go
I'm going to call on someone.
Maclaine, do you want to talk about Kaineng City a little bit?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Okay. So we heard a little bit about the slums, right? It has the really heavy duty synth kind of stuff. The rest of that map has it. It's not all dark and gloomy like that. But because it's this incredibly futuristic looking city, that's the one that leans hardest into the kind of synth and processed electronic, or electronically processed acoustic sounds. Much more heavy than any other map. And then within that has, kind of interesting gradations with the different tiers of the city. So there's the high level, which, is very kind of noble and stately feeling, a little aloof, I would say. The middle tier of the city is kind of the beating heart of it, right? It's where the working class people live, and it has much more energy to it, kind of a bustle to sort of capture the vibe of the city. And then the lower district, like you heard in the slums piece and some other stuff, it's just dark and grimy, and we don't want to think about that down there. We send all our trash to them and hope that it just goes away, but it doesn't go away. It turns into very nasty sounding music. So that was a fun map to play around in.
Yeah, then it takes us back to Echovald. We've done jungles and things like that before. We've never done a petrified forest, so
petrified fort. It's murky. It's kind of like a cathedral. It's huge. There's lots of verticality to it. Lush, dark reverbs. It's very padded and muted in contrasting something like Xingjie, which it's kept more natural. Todd Davies is the sound designer for that. His game profession is a necro, so it's kind of fun. It's like let's give him Echavald, and he's done such an amazing job. It's taken a long time. There's a lot of detail in there. There's a lot of state changes, and even when you're crafting, making sure everything is turning on and off. He's done an amazing job. And some of the sound design can be something you're kind of used to. Giant trees creaking and groaning and almost subsonic because they're so massive. And then you take it to down to the insects and creatures that are in the background that are, what is that? That's a little different. So we had an opportunity to try something different, and he took the baton and ran with it, and I'm happy to see where we got.
Yeah, and for the music, here's my egg-headed idea for this map. We have these giant, beautiful petrified trees, and to me that just immediately conjures images of the woodwind section of the orchestra, right? So there's a little bit of some of the Korean instruments in this, but it's the least sort of Asian-inspired map, I would say, of the four. So I leaned a little bit more into the orchestra, but because it's dark and murky, it's a lot of low woodwinds and low strings to kind of thicken things up. But if you look at an oboe, or maybe not an oboe so much, but a bassoon or a contrabassoon or a bass clarinet or an English horn, these instruments, they're made out of wood and they literally look like giant petrified trees. And so there's a lot of that kind of murkiness and they just sort of naturally have a warm sort of woolly sound to them, and I don't know, it just seemed like a perfect fit for Echavald.
Yeah, it sounds like it worked out super well. So the fourth map, do we want to talk about the sound and the music in the Jade Sea?
Jade Sea, anybody?
Drew's like, yes, give it to me.
So there's and this really contrasts Echavald, because Echavald is so padded and muted and longer delays and things like that. Jade Sea, bright, shimmery, it's a petrified ocean. Wow, that's interesting. It's undercurrent of magic, reflections, and things. So we did have a delay on there. That's kind of skipping. Like if you skipped a rock on an ocean, same thing. We did that with the sound effects and some music techniques. We can talk about the music a little later as far as mixing. But Jasmine Serrano stood up this map, did implementation and the events, and it's really, really fun. It was just like as you get closer to these blocks of jade, they have a little shimmery musicality to them. They have an energy, but it moves. We kept it moving through their samples, so we're kind of evolving the samples as you get closer, and it makes things a little more interesting than a static world. It's not just a petrified ocean; it's a living, kind of energetic world, right? And maybe Maclaine can talk about some of the music for that.
Yeah, so for this map, it has the least amount of ambient music because the nature of the content in the map is very, very combat focused. There's a lot of fighting that happens, so you'll hear a lot of combat music, tons. But when there were opportunities for ambient music, again, I wanted it to feel like, the music that would naturally kind of emerge from this sort of setting. And so it is very bright. It's very reflective, both reverbs and delays, bouncing around. The very first track I wrote for it, the kind of heart, the motor that sort of keeps it moving, is an instrument called a glass marimba. I don't have a glass marimba. It's a sample of a real one. I wish I had the real thing, but I don't yet. Maybe I'll get one someday. But, a marimba is a giant instrument that looks like, if you're not familiar, it looks like a huge xylophone, essentially. And the tines that you hit are made out of wood, right? You strike them with mallets, and it has, they resonate, but it has a very sort of warm wooden sound to it. It's a beautiful instrument, and hearing people that can play it well is a treat. But somewhere in the last few decades, somebody got the bright idea. Speaking of eggheads, to make one out of to make a marimba out of glass. So the resonating tines that you hit are made of plates of glass. And what's interesting is when you look at it, it looks like an instrument that might be made from the Jade Sea, because glass sort of naturally has a little bit of a greenish teal kind of tint to it. And when you put it all together in this beautiful instrument, it has this like very light, greenish blue hue, almost like my light back here. It's kind of like that. And so I thought, well, this is the perfect instrument for the Jade Sea. And then you just slap some delay on it as if it's bouncing around all these kind of, polished surfaces of frozen jade, or not frozen, but you know what I mean, petrified jade, frozen in place, let's say. So that you'll hear that sort of glassy, reflective kind of texture across all of the music for the Jade Sea.
Oh, wow. So my takeaway here is that the people with the egg-headed music ideas are the ones that come up with the really cool stuff. So I'm comfortable with, you just keep rolling with that. It's fine.
I mean, everybody has their own way of getting inspired, but for me, it has to start with some kind of idea, and it doesn't always have to be I'm physically in the place, but there's just got to be some hook that is, kind of, or a key, something that unlocks the creativity of that particular area. You want to try to make it new sounding. You want to try to make it specific to that area and unique from all the other areas. And I'm just grateful to have the opportunity to play around in these 4 areas, because they're so different for me, even outside of Guild Wars, right? And certainly within Guild Wars, if you've been working on something for a decade or more, you're looking for opportunities to get inspired by something new. So, this is the most fun I've had writing music for the game in a very long time.
I'm so glad to hear that. So one thing that I want to touch on before we keep moving forward, there was so much work and effort that went into this, and there's so much music. This couldn't possibly have been a solo effort. I mean, you're amazing, but a lot of people contributed to this. So I want to give you the chance to talk about those people as well.
Gladly. Drew kind of sprinkled in the additional sound design team into the maps. And so, it wasn't just the 2 of us doing all of this. I hope we don't give off that impression. It was really important for me to get help, knowing the scope of the game. I wanted to make sure that we incorporated other people, which we've done. It hasn't just been me the entire time I've been writing music for the game. There's always been at least 1 or 2 other people. But this is the biggest team we've worked with yet. So the first person I reached out to was a friend of mine named Michael Choi. And Michael is an unbelievable composer from Korea. I met him here in Los Angeles a few years ago, and we stayed in touch. He lives back in Korea now. But I thought, you can tell by looking at me, I am not Korean. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, I don't have any sort of inherent knowledge about this culture or music. So it took a lot of work for me to catch up. And I wanted to bring in people with a more authentic sort of Korean voice. And what was interesting about that, again, speaking of humbling and sort of teachable moments, I had a conversation with Michael very early about, what he could bring to the table. I knew was mostly familiar with his orchestral writing, which was gorgeous. He writes beautiful melodies and harmonies, and I knew that would be a perfect fit for Guild Wars. And I thought, it's the sort of added bonus of being Korean, and maybe he has a better understanding of this traditional music than I do. And he told me, very politely, he said, I'm not an expert in this. He was more familiar with it just because through osmosis and growing up there, you just hear it, but he's not an expert. And it just kind of, again, just sort of flipped the switch in my head and was very humbling about my assumptions, about this situation. If he was coming to me and said, hey, I'm working on a game that's set in colonial America, so you probably are an expert on all colonial folk songs of the 17th century, because you're an American, right? You must know about all that stuff. And of course the answer is no. I have no idea about any of that stuff. And so I think it was important to kind of not treat bringing in other people as sort of tokenism, right? Sure. I want to bring them in for their creativity and their expertise. Anyway, Michael, amazing composer, did a bunch of stuff for the Xingje map. The next person I brought in was a composer named Sojin Ryu, who I met through Michael, who's also an unbelievable composer. of traditional orchestra stuff, and she did a lot of the music for Echovald and a couple other pieces here and there, but writes beautiful melodies. Just I think I'm not sort of out of place here saying that Guild Wars music is beautiful and it should always be beautiful, even the ugly stuff. And so that was kind of my number one criteria: was will they get that, even if they have a unique voice, will they be able to sort of bring that beauty to the music?
Absolutely.
And Sojin is just writes some gorgeous stuff I really love. And then we brought back a couple returning favorites. So we have Brian Atkinson as part of the team. Brian's been kind of involved in the game for, I don't know, last 3 years, maybe a little bit more, doing trailer music for some of the marketing trailers, in-game cinematic music. And for this one, he did some combat music. So he did the cinematics for the game and helped flesh out the combat music and did an unbelievable job. He's just very complex writing that was challenging for the orchestra to play, but it sounds amazing. And then we have my friend Steve Pardo, Steve is somebody I've known for a long time, since we both sort of started our career in games at the same time many moons ago at Harmonix Music Systems in Boston. Steve wrote a special track that I don't want to give anything away about, but if you look up a little bit about Steve, you might get a sense of what that track would sound like. You'll know it when you hear it. Let's put it that way. And then of course the sort of marquee returning guest is Lena Rain, who Lena has been writing music for Guild Wars almost as long as I have. She contributed I think her first piece was for Winter's Day in 2012, the first Winter's Day festival. And kind of increased the amount of music we could get from her over the years. But she's been sadly missed and absent, at least for the last expansion. And so I knew it was really important to get her back. Lena is, such an important voice in the Guild Wars 2 sort of pantheon of music, and is so good at writing big, memorable boss encounter music that we brought her back for the final confrontation of the game, and she wrote a really special piece of music that I'm excited for people to hear. And then there's one other person that I want to mention, who is the MVP of this soundtrack. He's the most important person on this entire thing. The soundtrack would not have been possible without him. His name is Andy Roseland, and Andy is a composer that I met through asking around about, is there anyone out there who knows about traditional Korean music or knows anyone who plays these instruments? Can you put me in touch with someone? And eventually, through kind of extended game of telephone, I was introduced to Andy. Andy is an American, ironically grew up here in Los Angeles, but he's lived in Korea now for the last 30 years. He has a background studying traditional Western composition as well as traditional Korean music. And so I initially brought him on to write combat music, because I knew he would, like I said, understand those kind of intrinsic rhythmic structure and melodic structure that I wanted to capture for the combat music. But he grew into so much more than that, right? He ended up being my guru to teach me about this music. He was an unbelievable teacher for this kind of music. He was my weather vane to tell me, am I, going in the right direction? Is this even physically playable on some of these instruments? And sometimes you'd be like, yeah, if it was in this key. I'm like, right, that's important. They can't, they might not be able to play in whatever E flat, but they can play it in D perfectly. And also he was a translator. He speaks fluent Korean and was able to communicate to some of these soloists. Every one of those soloists that we showed in that montage video at the top were all recorded in Andy's studio in Seoul, and many of them were actually old classmates of his from when he was studying music at school. And he was saying, I'm grateful for this project for reconnecting me with some of these people who I haven't talked to in years, which I thought was pretty cool. So yeah, his fingerprints are on every single track, whether he wrote it or whether he was the person who, recorded the soloist on it. He touched every single piece of music on this score, and we would have fallen well short of the mark, I think, if he hadn't been involved. So my thanks to Andy for all of his help.
Wow, absolutely. And everybody's thanks to all of the people on this team. Like you said, this is a huge team working on this. And one thing that you've mentioned is all of the different places we recorded this, because these were recorded live all over the world. Do you all want to talk about that some?
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about Korea, obviously. That's where all the soloists were, and Andy recorded his parts as well. There, a lot of percussion and some other interesting instruments. I'm here in Los Angeles. I did what I could here between some live stuff and all my synth gear and all that kind of garbage around here. Lena is in Seattle. Sojin is in Chicago or Illinois, outside of Chicago. Michael and Andy, of course, are in Korea. The orchestra we recorded in Nashville they were just, I don't know, they were just amazing. I already talked about them, but they're amazing. And then my buddy Steve Pardo, also in Nashville. We recorded some other soloists, a soloist named Kristen Nagus, who is an incredible multi-instrumentalist, recorded a couple things for us in Florida, where she lives. And then even down to the mixing, which also happened not in the United States. And maybe Drew can talk a little bit about the mixing and the technical side of the score.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, we have a high quality lineage in our soundtracks, and I wanted to respect that as much as we could. And there's new opportunities now, and I wanted to explore an immersive experience using Dolby Atmos. So the entire soundtrack is mixed in Dolby Atmos, which is just so fun and amazing. I want you, as a listener, as you're listening to it outside of the game, to still be immersed in, Tyria, in Cantha, and that's important. And I think we got there, and I'm so happy. The sounds will be from the side of you and to the rear, and even in the ceiling. They can be very dramatic, as we talked before with this cello. As it bows and stops and the delay catches it and it distorts, does that just stay in right where that cello was? Maybe not. Maybe it ripples into the room a little bit as the wind instruments are playing, to not be shadowed by the strings and the cellos. This is kind of like first wall in the stage. They're behind. So what if we just pulled them up in space a little bit, kind of pull them up into the ceiling speakers? It gives them a little lift, broadens that scope, that sound stage. And so we're bringing that listener in. It's kind of like if the normal speakers were in front of you, as they usually are, we want you to just walk 2-3 steps forward, and so everything just kind of wraps around you. And like I said, sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's very dramatic. I think there's an Echovald piece that it starts off. We intentionally started off centered in the mono speaker, and then it just ripples all the way down, and it takes, I think, 4 or 5 seconds each time this delay happens. So you really just are drawn into this world. Wow. It was so fun. It took us 2-3 months, Maclaine and I and Simon and the people at Sound and Motion down in Cape Town, Africa. So yes, another world experience, working on chat calls and dialing in. He's later in his night, we're earlier in the morning, so we had to kind of coordinate our times. We would do these reviews at 8, 9 in the morning and would go for a couple hours. We actually listened to everything in surround as we were exploring this new opportunity of immerse audio. We would kind of stand up this template, and we started with the main theme because that had literally the kitchen sink, right? Everything, all the instruments, the synthesizers, the gugak instruments, the big heavy orchestra. Yeah. So that was so fun to stand it up and then make sure that it wasn't too much, like it's focused. The listener's not going to get too overwhelmed. And then we started listening to it in stereo. So how does that translate to normal speakers? We wanted to make sure it translates everywhere. Big array, stereo speakers, and then binaural. So even if you don't have a big theater, put on some headphones. A lot of people have headphones now, I hear. So you can play it on your phone and stream it in Dolby Atmos and listen to the whole soundtrack. So that was a lot of fun. I think some of those opportunities in the the different maps is, Xingjie is more natural. We did have some delays, like we said before, delays with some of the solo instruments, but we kept it kind of natural and traditional. Kainang, more delays, distortions, souped it up, ripples down the side. Echovald, we actually Echovald was interesting. We had a frozen lake in Washington, and we skipped rocks on it, and it goes doo, pew, 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 pew. Sounds really cool. We actually took that and made a delay out of it in surround sound and added that into the music, which is just me and Simon kind of riffing and having a fun time saying, like, how can we make this even more interesting? Echovald's very dark, so we padded, we kind of generated our own reverbs and use cinematic rooms to shape all of these different maps aesthetically, so they all kind of fit, which was really cool. As I said, we collaborated with the team, Simon, Carl, and Jade at Sound and Motion, and I have a video of Simon playing with his sweet rig, and yeah, let's check it out.
Yeah.
Hey, Fuzz.
Hello. More traditional orchestra. Just come to here. So you can see like certain elements coming in at different times. So it's not just a front plane. It's panned out and pulled back into Atmos. And then on top of that, you've got the so little things like having wind instruments kind of like slightly elevated in space, that kind of thing. And then you've got the Gugak Orchestra, the Korean orchestra, which is outrageous and awesome. And then that has to that slots in with the more traditional Western orchestra, if you like. So it's essentially almost like having, if I do that, almost like having two orchestras at the same time. Just open this all up. Okay, this is all made neat, thanks to Carl. But we've obviously got all our effects up here, a combination of stereo effects and Atmos effects. So using cinematic reverbs, for example, you can see there's longer and shorter halls, automated for different slower and faster sections. Then live orchestra, which is then split out into your winds and brass and various passes, that kind of thing. But ultimately, everything then basically goes down to this matrix down here. So you've got subgroup stems. So these are objects, multi-channel objects. If I just take violin as an example, so I'm just catching up. So you can see that that's kind of like in the Atmos space is actually not panned so high, but these are just the spots of the strings, of string one, or violin one, just as an example. So there's high, that's flute, for example, that's an object. So you get a sense of height based on the fact that it's in Atmos, and then go into final stems. And then the stems come up here as beds, so you've got percussion stem, synth stem, etc. These are all objects. We're using multi-channel objects for the main orchestra and then for the reverbs. And it took a really long time to figure that out. So we've kind of withdrew. We just drew at ArenaNet, just trying to figure out, how all the panning, just kind of like how the mic array would work. And then I sat experimenting with my terrible handwriting, just various ways of packing it out. So it took, quite a bit of time to just kind of build the matrix that we have here, which has now come in at about 500. And when it's fully specced out with all the samples and things, that comes in at about 500, between 450 and 550 tracks, more or less. That's the story.
Nice.
Yeah, fun. So lots of tracks, lots of effects, and we pulled it all together, and I think, made a beautiful soundtrack. It's 58 tracks in total, at 2.5 hours long, which is so great. Gives us more variety. It really stitches into each one of those maps and makes sure that they have coverage for all of them. And we went a step further. In this last few years, Chris Burgess has been working on alternative variations where we're asking the composers to deliver stems so we can actually kind of stretch out the music. And we did the same approach with End of Dragons. And so Simon would finish a mix. He would send me the project file. I would open it up into my workstation. I would, mute and solo and kind of figure out what I wanted as an alternate option. So I do, 3, 4, 5 alts per cue, per track, and send that back to him. And then he would render everything. So it was just really a great way to imagine more without composing more. So we already had 2.5 hours, which is a lot. So we actually ended up with 8.5 hours of alternate assets. And it's so nice. I mean, just having that just for the combat alone, just to have that original, just the lower drive, the percussion, just a few instruments, and then it kind of builds, adds in the strings or adds in the brass, or maybe it's just the percussions and the gugok instruments. We have a interesting little video. I can kind of break down the alternative arrangements for you. Why don't we watch that? Yeah, I mean, I think you can hear how it's complex and then it breaks down. I think the really nice thing about the alternate mixes as well as they stitch into the soundscape more. So as we're just kind of coming up to this event or another encounter, if things are simple in a few layers, then you get the sound effects and the music kind of blending. And then as the event kind of blooms and gets more intense, more instrumentation comes on, more drive, more intense sound effects, your skill palette of your profession kind of kicks in. And so it's a lot more dense. So they all kind of bloom at the same time. This is really, really fun. I think that it turned out really well. And there's one more member of our team that after all of that, after we mixed everything, we have to master it. And so Nathan Moody was our mastering engineer. He is, where is he? He's in LA as well. And
no, he's in the Bay Area. He's in the Bay Area.
Oh, he's in San Francisco. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And yeah, he took everything, listened intently to all the details, made sure that they were balanced over all the tracks, and so nothing just kind of really pokes out. He also went through all of the alternative mixes and made sure that those were leveled as well. So we did all this mastering before we shipped the game. So all of the in-game assets are top notch. Sometimes we would ship a Living World episode or an expansion and then master it and then do the streaming. So this was all done beforehand, and it's such a treat to have it all done, and we just kind of drop it in and let it go. So yeah, it's quite an experience going through that whole process. And but wow, I'm so thankful for this entire team and what we have accomplished. That's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that the whole theme of all of this music and sound design conversation today has been, but wait, there's more. And there's
Right.
so much music, and everyone involved has had so much fun with it. But the thing is, there's still more to talk about as we wrap up. And Maclaine, I'm actually going to turn to you to talk about the pre-order on the vinyl soundtrack and what's coming with that, because it's amazing.
Sure. So we're lucky enough to have a third installment of the Guild Wars music on vinyl via the incredible people at I Am 8-Bit. So they did a vinyl release for the Heart of Thorn soundtrack and for the Path of Fire soundtrack, which Drew, I think, has, hopefully.
It looks like this. Oh, here it comes. Oh my God, it's gorgeous.
Yeah.
They go out of their way to really, they keyed in, it's green for Heart of Thorns. It's kind of like that purpley hue for Path of Fire. It's so cool. And open it up, we got the concept art. Oh, this one doesn't open.
Wait.
Just kidding. Concept, but there's more on a revolving stage. But yeah, it's pretty cool. They go out of their way, and we're bringing it to you this time as well.
Yeah, so it'll you can sort of see, I guess, if you go to iam8bit.com, there it is. They'll have it for pre-order. This is just a mock-up, but it's aesthetically in line with the previous two soundtracks, with the unique logo and color scheme for End of Dragons. It's just so cool to have. I do have copies. They're at home. I should have some in the studio here, but I have them at home so I can listen to them. But pre-orders are open now. They opened this week. If you pre-order it, you will get a code that on February 28th, when the game launches, you'll be able to download the entire soundtrack. So there's physical restrictions to how much music you can put onto vinyl albums. So it's kind of it's kind of the highlights that represents every map, every composer. But there's only 25 tracks or something like that, 26. Yeah, there's the mid-20s on the vinyl, but there's 58 in total. So, if you get the vinyl, you'll get the code that will essentially double the amount of music you get. And I can't wait to get my hands on one. They're so cool looking, and to have all three of them together will be special.
Yeah, they are absolutely gorgeous. I'm going to give you a little preview of next week. Starting late next week, we're also going to preview a few End of Dragons music tracks for you that you haven't heard yet. That starts next Thursday, but they are going to be coming to you in a way in kind of an unexpected way. I'm going to leave it at that. Streaming stereo on February 28th. And Drew, do you want to talk a little bit about that and the Dolby Atmos mixes?
Yeah, all 58 tracks will be stereo, the stereo version on February 28th with Dolby Atmos to follow. So we'll be streaming on lots of different platforms. I'm sure you can find one to best suit you and the ones that you have. I'm very, very eager to ship this out to you all.
Oh my gosh, we're so close. It's almost there. All right. As we wrap up, one more thing I do want to touch on. Drew, you're here representing the audio team because physical restrictions, we can't fit everybody and they're super busy, but you have called out a few of them. So I do want to thank the rest of the audio team who's been working so hard on this expansion.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're still head down. We're in the final days. I appreciate this team so much. They are doing everything they can. It's like there's music is a tip of the iceberg. It takes probably 85% more stuff to do sound effects, VO, implementation, and I've mentioned a few of them already. I would say the other MVP of this team is Joseph Clark. He is the lead sound designer on End of Dragons, and I can't thank him enough. He is an amazing sound designer. He's an amazing lead. He does not stop at anything. He will not stop until this expansion has the right sound on everything. He has touched almost every part of this expansion, supporting others, been just a wonderful collaborator and implementer, and yeah, he's just and just a super friendly person overall. So, yeah, thank you, Joe. I've talked about Chris Burgess, and he's done even large scale meta events, helping Jasmine out, and yeah, his work is all over. Lots of MTX items. What else? I mean, tons of stuff. Todd
That's
Davies,
so much,
like I
yeah.
said, was on Echovald. Um, he did a lot of other things, supporting events as well. Sung Ha Hong, I mentioned. Keenan Sig, strong implementer. We gave him a lot of the story instances and strike missions. Rob Mills is a very well-rounded sound designer. We could just throw anything at him, like fishing. Go fishing. Go fishing, Rob. How about this large scale event? We need something to, blow up in this huge way or something, whatever. Sure, he's got it. So he's came in swinging and learned the tools very quickly. So thank you, Rob. And Jasmine Serrano, one of our younger members, and she's taken to game design really well and is so friendly to work with. She knows her stuff and continues to not only do her own tasks but support others too as they need it. So yeah, there's so much to talk about in sound effects. I really want to have another segment to give everyone on our audio team just some time to shine in this light. And so looking forward to that. I can't thank them enough for all that they've accomplished. I'm so proud of them all. Yeah, I'm speechless. And if I get to the end, Maclaine, I'm such an honor to work with you in this last 2 years on End of Dragons.
Aww.
Thank you for all of your effort. And this collaboration has just been unreal. I so thankful. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you, Drew, and of course, thank you to ArenaNet for the continued opportunity to make music for this special game and push boundaries of what we think belongs in it, and of course, thank you to the players for keeping the game alive. We wouldn't be here talking about it if it wasn't for you all. So I just can't wait to get this out there, and I've been itching for years to finally be able to talk about this stuff and celebrate all the work that all these amazing people have done. And yeah, I'm very proud of it. So I hope that fans love it.
You absolutely should be super proud of it. So yeah, we are very close to everybody hearing it. And that's our show for today. Thank you, Maclaine and Drew, for joining today. Thanks to everybody on both of the teams that you work with. And thanks to all of you for watching. We are 10 days away from End of Dragons. We have lots more to share in these last 10 days too. Before End of Dragons launches, just keep your eyes open, watch our social media channels, watch our website so you don't miss anything, because you're not gonna want to. We will see you in Cantha on Monday, February 28th. See you then.